Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Ashrafil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In last week's lesson, we touched on three topics related with divorce and talaq. I firstly mentioned about the topic of zihar, which means where a husband says to his wife or compares his wife with something which is unlawful and haram upon him. Such as he says to his wife that you are like my mother's back, or you are like my mother's private parts. And I explained that your mother, she's your mahram, so you can look at her face, you can look at her arms, you can look at her hands, but there are certain parts of your own mother you can't look at, such as the private parts, her back, the upper thighs and so on. You're not allowed to look at that area of your mother. So now if someone compares his wife and he says to his wife that you are like the back of my mother, or you are like my thighs of my mother, what in other words he's trying to say is that the same way for me to look at my mother's back is haram, for me to look at my mother's upper thighs are haram, for me to na'udhu billah look at my mother's private parts is haram, you are also haram upon me as well. So this was touched on and looked at in detail last week. We then moved along and we looked at another topic which in Arabic is called ila. And ila is where a husband takes an oath, makes a qasam that he is not going to have intercourse with his wife for 4 months or more. So he says to his wife that I'm never ever going to have intercourse with you, or I'm not going to have intercourse with you for 6 months or a year. So now I mentioned that as soon as 4 months passes, then automatically one talaq will occur. And then the third topic I touched on last week was the topic in Arabic known as li'an. And li'an is where a husband, he suspects his wife of cheating on him, or he suspects or he accuses his wife of committing adultery and zina. Then what is the Sharia guidance with regards to that? That was touched on. These three topics, zihar, li'an and ila, were touched on in last week's lesson. Now in this week's lesson we're going to move along with the topic of talaq and divorce. And the topic which I'm going to begin this week's lesson is a topic which can sometimes happen through divorce or talaq, but sometimes it can also happen when a husband passes away. And we call this in Islam or in Arabic as iddah, the waiting period. Now iddah literally means to count, and shar'an, i.e. technically, iddah means when a husband divorces his wife. So the wife mourning because of the termination of nikah. Nikah, marriage, is a blessing and a ni'mat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same way knowledge is a blessing from Allah. The same way eyes are blessing from Allah. Same way ears are blessing from Allah. Then as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِسْتَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِنْ شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ, which means that if you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessings, so you thank Allah for what He has given you. He's given you children, that's a blessing. He's made you married. He's given you a wife as a partner, as a spouse, that's a blessing. He's given you eyes, that's blessing. Knowledge, that's blessing. So Allah says that if you thank Him, now how do you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And there's two ways. Either number one, after every namaz or whenever you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the second way of thanking Allah is what He has given you, the blessing He has given you. You use that ni'mat and blessing in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah has given you knowledge and ilm, which is a blessing and a ni'mat, then you use that ilm and knowledge for the obedience of Allah. You don't use that ilm and knowledge to look for loopholes. Sometimes people, when they have a lot of knowledge, then sometimes you could look for loopholes. It's like, say, those who are lawyers, when they know the law, inside out. They could look for loopholes in the words or in the statutes or in the acts of parliament. So Allah says that thanking me is in obedience. So Allah has given you knowledge, which is a ni'mat, then you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has given you eyes, then you use the eyes to obey Allah. You don't use the eyes to view unlawful materials or to look at unlawful women. Allah has given you ears and hearing, so that's a blessing. So use the hearing and the blessing of this particular ni'mat to understand the Quran, to listen to the Quran, to listen to talks, to listen to lectures, to listen to hadith, not to listen to music, not to listen to other unlawful talks and other unlawful things. Now then the ayat goes on to say that if you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, la azidannakum, Allah will give you more, Allah will increase. Allah has given you knowledge and ilm. Now if you thank Allah for this knowledge and ilm, la azidannakum, Allah will open doors for you. Allah will give you barakah in your ilm. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make you learn more. Because knowledge is such that after you do your alim degree, doesn't mean that you know everything. There's so much things to learn. Similarly, whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you a ni'mat, say wealth, now if you spend it in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what would happen? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you more wealth. That's why it's mentioned in a hadith that sadaqah never ever decreases wealth, but instead sadaqah and charity and zakat always increases wealth because of this ayat. Then the next part of the ayat then goes on to say, لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ وَلَإِن كَفَرْتُمْ إِنَّ عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ, which means that if you do na shukri, kafartum, if you are ungrateful to Allah, then indeed my punishment, i.e. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment, is severe. Now what does that mean? It means that when Allah has given you blessings and ni'mats and you don't thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish you. And how does Allah punish? Allah punishes you by taking away that blessing, taking away that ni'mat. We hear many stories of people who did become alims, who did become ulamas, who did become maulanas and muftis and scholars. They did their 6-year, 7-year alim class. So that was a blessing Allah gave them. But because they didn't act upon their knowledge, because they didn't thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we now see them, the beard's gone, the topi is gone, the qamis is gone, and now they totally different. They dyed their hair blonde, they got step cut, this kind of thing. No, alamat of an alim anymore. And there's many examples. We see people who Allah has given them eyesight, then they use it for wrong things. Allah takes away their eyesight. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them money. That's another good example we could see. That money, wealth, they use it in haram places. They never gave zakat, they never gave sadaqah and charity. Then what happens? Allah takes everything away. Now they're bankrupt. Now they're living on dole. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do. So as I was saying, obviously slightly moved away from the topic, but nikah and marriage is a ni'mat and blessing from Allah. So to mourn, to show that sadness of the termination of the nikah, then you should observe, the woman should observe the iddah. That's one. And the second situation where she observes the iddah is when her husband passes away, and again to show the mourning of the losing of her husband because of the loss of her husband, the loss of nikah. That's why the Sharia makes iddah obligatory and wajib upon her. Now you may be thinking to yourself that iddah is something khas or something peculiar with Islam. That only in Islam or Muslims observe iddah. But actually when we look through the religions of the world and the societies of the world, whenever a husband would pass away, women would observe iddah. But their iddah would be totally different to what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to do. Take an example of Hindus, that whenever a husband passes away, and I think it's still prevalent now, they would cremate the husband's body. But along with the cremating of the husband's body, they would also cremate the wife as well. So the wife would have to die. But because obviously they believe in reincarnation, so if, say, for example, a husband's going to come back as a cow or something like that, then the wife's going to come back as a cow as well. So basically, anyway, that's another issue. But what I'm trying to say is that the wife also gets cremated. She dies as well. So they kill her and then they cremate her body. So even when you look in other religions as well, they do have the concept of iddah. Even before the intervention or the prophethood of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was iddah. The people of Makkah, the mushrikeens of Makkah, they would also observe iddah as well. So whenever the husband would pass away, then the women would have to observe iddah. Now it's mentioned in a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawood and Sunan Tirmidhi that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam explained to us the iddah and the waiting period of the people of Makkah. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that whenever a husband would pass away, a woman would be locked in isolation, in seclusion for 1 year. So for 1 year she'd be locked in a room. Like you could say a prison sentence, locked in isolation she would be for 1 year. And during that 1 year, she was not allowed to have a ghusl or have a bath. Now, within a few days when we don't have a shower bath, we feel a bit uncomfortable. So imagine for 1 year not having a ghusl or a bath. And not only that, she wasn't allowed to change her clothes. So for 1 year, she would have to wear the same clothes, no ghusl, no bath, and obviously fragrance and khushbu, that's dur ki baat hai. If she's not allowed to do that, then obviously batariq awla, she would not be allowed to apply fragrance and khushbu and these kind of things. And then the hadith goes on to say that when the year would pass, then a cow or a goat or any other camels or any other cows or smaller animals would be brought into her room. And then she would be told to rub her body on that animal. So she would then get on the cow or the goat, and she would then rub her body over the cow, over the goat. And then she would wait for the cow or the goat to pass some stool. So then the cow or the goat will pass stool, and this woman would then pick up the stool and then throw it away. And then that would be a sign, are you throwing the stool or the dung away, was a sign that her iddat has now finished and has now terminated. Then she would be allowed to marry someone else if she does so. Now that was the concept of iddah before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in Islam we have iddah, but it's not for 1 year, it's for 4 months, 10 days if the husband passes away, as we're going to look at later. And also the Sharia allows that during the iddah, the woman, she's allowed to go for ghusl, she's allowed to keep herself clean and presentable. Certain types of perfume she should refrain from, as we're going to look at later. And also, if a husband has passed away, the Sharia does say, and as we're going to look at later as well, that she can actually leave the home. If there's no one there to provide for her, then she can go to work and support herself. But as soon as night falls, as soon as her work finishes, then she will have to return home. So this is the broadness of the Sharia, and also the flexibility of the Sharia, and more importantly the moderation of the Sharia given to us by Allah and His beloved Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now somebody may ask this question, that what is the wisdom or what is the benefit of iddah nowadays? What is what's the problem if, say for example, if a woman is divorced today and then tomorrow she goes and gets married to someone else? What's the problem? Now there are two wisdoms. There's actually many more, but I'm just going to jot or make mention two here. There are two main reasons why Islam and the Sharia obliges the woman to observe a iddah and a waiting period. Now the two reasons are, number one is because remember, iddah doesn't have to be through death. It could also come through divorce and talaq. Now, if, say for example, the reason why we have the iddah and the waiting period is, just say for argument's sake, if the husband gave his wife talaq and divorce out of anger, or just say for example the husband in the spur of the moment wasn't, he got a bit frustrated and certain things, probably work pressure, other pressure from other people, bills, these kind of things. And then he got into a heated argument with his wife, and then spur of the moment, without thinking, he said the words talaq. Now, having this iddah and waiting period would then help and enable the husband to revoke the talaq and the divorce. As we probably touch on later, that when a husband gives his wife talaq and divorce, just one talaq, then within her waiting period, which is 3 menstruation cycles, the husband can revoke that talaq and take his wife back. There's no need for them to redo the nikah again. So that is a blessing or the flexibility from the Sharia, that husband spur of the moment has given his wife talaq, then without redoing the nikah or without going to the local imam and asking the local imam, look, can you redo my nikah for me, without anybody else knowing, in other words, because as you know, especially in our Asian community, if you go to local imam to redo your nikah, then the imam then tells somebody else, and then the entire community knows, oh, this guy has just given his wife talaq. So without without the problems, without the issues, without the fuss, the Sharia says, okay, within the iddah, the waiting period, the husband can just take his wife back. There's no need for them to redo the nikah. And this is quite clearly mentioned in a hadith, because you may be thinking, oh, why does this happen? It happens because, as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said in a hadith which can be found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, that al-anatu min Allah, which means calmness is from Allah, wal-ujlatu min ash-shaytan, and jaldbazi, i.e. hasteness, is from shaitan. Now what does that mean? It means that sometimes husbands, spur of the moment, they just just give the talaq, and then they realize, oh, what have I done? So the Sharia has given them this grace period of iddah, that they could redo, or not redo, but get back together with their wife without the need of redoing the nikah and the marriage. And just a point here is that this unfortunately happens to a lot of people, is they always want things to happen. They always overnight they want everyone to be pious, or they want, overnight they want this masjid to be all beautiful, or they want, if they have a madrasa or a maktab, they want overnight all the children to be all pious and know their tajweed and know their du'as and know their qaida or know their recitation of the Holy Quran. It doesn't work like that. And this is beautifully explained through the actions of Allah, because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, He could have created this world in a blink of an eye. But instead, how many days did Allah create this world in? 6 days. Now why did Allah do it in 6 days? Is to show al-anatu min Allah, calmness, doing things soch samajh kar, aram se. Min Allah is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whereas wal-ujla, like doing things quickly, hurriedly, as again our attributes or our qualities are, we just want to get the job done. So whether it's like bending the rules, or not getting the right certificates, or not getting permission from the council, and we just quickly make a mosque and so on, and then eventually gets knocked down. So wal ujla min ash-shaytan is from shaitan. So this is obviously we need to understand that whenever it comes to divorce and talaq, we should think about it. Linking it with what we're talking about, this topic and the subject. If a husband does decide to give talaq and divorce, he should think about it, do mashwara, even do istikhara, and then when he thinks that, this probably is the right decision, then he should give the talaq and the divorce. So I was saying that's one wisdom of iddah, that the husband can take his wife back during this grace period. And the second, and this is the most important, why we have the waiting period, is so that the child's lineage would not be mixed up, would not be confused if the wife or the woman had gone and got married to someone else. Just for example, husband, he gave his wife talaq and divorce. Just say he gave his wife talaq and divorce today on a Saturday. Now if there was no obligation or no concept of iddah, just say this very woman, the next day she goes and gets married. Now a week later, this woman then finds out that she's pregnant. Now you could then imagine that the first husband will say, well, no, that could be my child, because it could be his child. But the second husband will say, no, that could be my child as well. So it will then lead to a lot of confusion in who's the father of this child. And we'll touch on this about paternity and so on. But it will lead to confusion that who's the father here. And obviously, there will be quarrels, disputes, these kind of things. So to then protect, and similarly, if this child grows up, he will be then thinking, oh, is this guy my father? Or is this guy my father? And so on. So, it will lead to quarrels and disputes and confusion. So therefore, the Sharia says that, okay, when a woman divorce takes place or a husband passes away, she should wait and, wait 3 menstruation cycles. If a husband passes away 4 months and 10 days, then within that, obviously a woman will be able to tell whether she's pregnant or not. And then obviously afterwards, when the waiting period finishes, then obviously she would be allowed to marry someone else. Now the next point you mention about iddah and waiting period, or the next ruling, is the time limits. That when a husband divorces his wife, or if a husband passed away, then for how long would the woman remain in iddah and would remain in her waiting period before she would be fully out of the nikah and she would be allowed to marry someone else if she does wish. Now if a husband passes away, first ruling is that if a husband passes away, the Quran quite clearly says, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ وَعَشْرًا, which means that the wife or the woman, her waiting period would be 4 months and 10 days. So husband passes away, the woman, the widow, her waiting period will be 4 months and 10 days. No ifs or buts, because it's quite clearly mentioned in the Quran. Irrespective if the woman happens to be 80 or 90, it doesn't matter. Whether she's a young woman in her 20s, mid-20s, or whether she's in her 70s and 80s, the same rule applies. Her waiting period is 4 months and 10 days. Just a couple of days ago, I got a call from someone that his father-in-law passed away. So his mother-in-law, she's in her 80s. So he was asking that, well, there's no danger of fitna, she's not going to go and marry someone else again. So does she have to observe the iddah? So the rule is that it doesn't matter how old she is, whether she was 100 and her husband passed away, she would still have to observe the iddah of 4 months and 10 days. Even though obviously that, because obviously the reason I mentioned, or the hikmah of iddah, was to see whether a woman is pregnant or not. So obviously zahir here that if she's 80, 85 or something, you're not going to be pregnant, but it's still an order and a ruling of the Sharia that irrespective how old the woman is, her iddah when her husband passes away is 4 months and 10 days. The second ruling here is that when a husband either divorces his wife, or if the husband passes away, if the wife happens to be pregnant, then her iddah and her waiting period is until she gives birth to the child. Until she gives birth to the child. Because as I explained, the reason why we have iddah is to make sure that the child belongs to the husband before and not to the new husband. So now just say, for example, the husband divorced his wife, just say she was already pregnant, and just say a month later the wife gives birth to the child. So that's it. After a month, this wife now would be out of her waiting period. She will then obviously observe the nifas, and then after the postnatal bleeding, if she wants, she can then get married to someone else. And to tell, she doesn't even have to observe the nifas as well. Even during the nifas and postnatal bleeding, if she was to get married to someone else, the nikah would be valid and correct. Similarly, if the wife was pregnant and husband passed away, and then a week later the wife gives birth to the child, then again her iddah is finished. So whether the husband dies, because obviously if the wife was not pregnant, then it would have been 4 months and 10 days. But if the wife is pregnant, then as soon as she gives birth to the child, then she's out of her iddah and she's out of her waiting period. And there's an example of this which can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari, that there was a female companion, and on top of my head her name was Subayya. And what happened was that she was pregnant when her husband passed away. and he passed away during the Battle of Badr. So what happened was that she was pregnant, husband passed away, and literally as soon as he passed away, a few days later, she gave birth to the child. So thereafterwards, this female companion, she then beautified herself so that she could then get married again, because that's how simple the Sahabiyats were, that as soon as the husband would pass away, they would observe the iddah, they would then beautify themselves and wait and hope for another proposal. Like with the case of Hazrat Hafsa radiallahu anha, that when her husband, Huzafa radiallahu anhu, Khansa bin Huzafa radiallahu anhu, when he passed away, so then Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu then offered his daughter firstly to Hazrat Usman radiallahu anhu, then to Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and then afterwards Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam proposed for Hazrat Hafsa radiallahu anha. So I was saying that she then got ready to get married, this female companion Subay'ah. Then some of the men were saying to her that, why are you getting ready to get married? You're supposed to be observing the iddah of 4 months and 10 days. So she then went to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and explained that this is what happened, that my husband passed away, and then a few days later I then gave birth to a child. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Bas, that's it. As soon as you given birth to the child, you are now free to marry whoever you want, because your iddah and your waiting period has finished." So that's the second ruling here. Now the third ruling which I want to mention is, if a husband, so we looked at wafat, i.e. death, we've looked at if a woman is pregnant. The third point here is that if a husband divorces his wife, gives his wife talaq, then what is the waiting period of this particular woman? Now the waiting period of this woman is that if she is a woman who menstruates, then her iddah, her waiting period would be 3 menstruation cycles. So just say, for example, husband gave a divorce 15th of September, then just say a week later she starts her first menstruation cycle, then the next month, October, that menstruation cycle, then the November's menstruation cycle. Then as soon as she finishes or passes the November menstruation cycle, that's it, the iddah and the waiting period has finished, and she would now be allowed to marry someone else. So if a woman who menstruates, her iddah waiting period will be 3 menstruation cycles. And if it's a woman who doesn't menstruate, just say she's in a menopause, and menopause normally for a woman starts after 55 or above. So just say if a woman who's in her 60s, her husband divorces her, now her iddah, her waiting period would be 3 months. So if a husband say divorced her on 15th September, then 3 months later would be the ending and the termination of her iddah and her waiting period. So that is the ruling with regards to divorce and talaq. So remember, if the husband passes away, it's 4 months and 10 days. If the husband gives his wife talaq and divorce, if she menstruates, then it's 3 menstruation cycles. If she is a non-menstruating woman, then it's 3 months. Which then takes me on to the next point, is that when does the period of iddah start? Now remember, it's very simple. It starts when the husband passes away. So just say for iddat wafat, the waiting period would start when the husband passed away, irrespective of whether the wife was there and she knows about it or she sees it with her own eyes or not. The waiting period will start from there. So just say for argument's sake, a wife was just say she was in England and her husband has gone somewhere, just say he's gone Pakistan, and he died there or he got killed there. And 5 months later, the wife finds out that, oh, my husband has been dead for 5 months or so. But during those 4 months and 10 days, she didn't observe iddah. She was like, doing her own things. Now, as soon as she finds out 5 months later, her iddah's finished. That's it, it's gone. Because the thing is that as soon as the husband passes away, iddah starts, whether the wife knows about you or not. So the 4 months are 10 days past, and just say she finds out 6 months later or a year later that her husband passed away. So because the 4 months and 10 days have already gone, so she will now be free to marry whoever she wants. Similarly, with regards to talaq and divorce, that the talaq and divorce will start from the moment the husband gave his wife talaq and divorce. If the husband gave his wife talaq and divorce today, the 15th of September, the 3 menstruation cycle will begin from now. Or if it's, say, like for example, a court divorce or a talaq through a Sharia council, so the date which is stated in that piece of paper on the top right hand corner, so if they say 15th of September, so even though you may have received the letter a week later, so you may have received, or she received it a week later, but it says on the 15th of September, such and such a husband has given such and such a wife talaq and divorce, then her iddah will start from that previous week. So obviously during that week, if she was on a period, then that would be counted as 1 menstruation cycle gone. So remember, the waiting period, it starts from the time the talaq is given, or it starts from the time when the husband has passed away. Just very quickly, another ruling here with regards to the place of iddah. Now remember, whenever a husband passes away, or if the husband gives his wife talaq and divorce, the rule of the Sharia is that the wife has to observe iddah in the marital house she was living in with her husband. So just for example, husband and wife, they've been living in one particular house. So husband gives a divorce and talaq there. Husband passes away. Then in that very marital house, that's where the wife would have to observe the iddah. Now, you may be thinking, oh, what should the husband do in that? Because obviously it's going to be a bit awkward for the husband to be there. So what should the husband do for the 3 menstruation cycles? So just say he's given his wife talaq and divorce. So what the decent thing the husband should do, and the Sharia thing the husband should do, is that let his wife have the house for 3 months and so on. Just say if it's his own house, so let him have it for 3 months. And then for the 3 months or the 3 menstruation cycle, the husband should then say move in with somebody else, just go somewhere else for a few months, and then when her menstruation cycle finishes, then the wife would then be told to then return back to her parents' home, and then the husband will then move back in. Obviously that is the ideal way. Obviously nowadays what tends to happen is the wife will then leave the house and she tends to go back to her parents' house and observe the iddah there. Now the question is that, is this allowed or not? The only rule which I can find in the books of fiqh is that the scholars have said that if the wife fears of any kind of abuse, or she fears that her honor or her dignity may be compromised by staying in that house where her husband had given her talaq and divorce, then only in that situation she would be allowed to leave the marital house and then observe the iddah and the waiting period at her parents' house or somewhere else. Now what do we mean by her honor being compromised in terms of, just say husband's given a divorce and talaq. Now the wife fears that if she was to remain in the house, husband may force himself on her. In particular, if the husband's given her 3 talaqs, where obviously if it was 1 talaq, as we look at later, husband can take it back again. But if it was 3 talaqs where relationship is broken now, so husband may force himself on the wife in terms of rape, these kind of things. So the wife fears, this is not safe for me. Or the husband could be a bit more abusive, that husband may be thinking, oh, it was the wife who pushed me to give the 3 talaqs, and now I can't be with her. He may get a bit aggressive, may harm the wife. If they have little children, she fears that the husband may harm the children so that he can get his own back at the wife. So in those situations, then the wife would be allowed to leave the marital house and then go and observe the iddah in her parents' home. But that's the only situation. Where, say for example, that is not the case, then generally speaking, the rule of the Sharia is that she should try to observe it in that particular house where she would live with her husband, and where she was living in when her husband gave her talaq and gave her divorce. Inshallah, there's one or two sections about idda which we will continue with in next week's lesson. Allah gives the tawfiq to everyone's been said. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.